Okay, so like Mrs. E said, I'm a research support specialist, which is basically a fish biologist. I am not a climate researcher, but I do research fish and their climate is important. I work at the Cornell Biological Field Station, which is on Oneida Lake, which many of you have seen. Here's a cool picture of our field station. It's a beautiful place to work and a beautiful lake. This is Oneida Lake. So this is a USGS topo map. And basically what I want you to see is it's a big lake. It's got a lot of ins and outs. It's got a lot of different habitats. And that makes it sort of complex to study because there's a lot of different areas and stuff. It's about 20 miles long and it's about 4 miles wide. So it's a big lake. But even being a big lake, it's only a tiny dot in the larger frame of things. All right, compared to Lake Ontario, Oneida Lake is tiny. So it doesn't develop a lot of the lake effect patterns that we see from Lake Ontario because it is a lot smaller. It's got about 80 square miles of area. Its average depth is only about 20 feet. Most of the lake is only about 30 feet deep, and the maximum depth is about 55 feet. Now, compared to the Finger Lakes, some of those lakes are 200, 300, 400 feet deep. So Oneida Lake is much shallower. Oneida Lake is a polymictic lake, which means that it mixes often, and it's mostly the same temperature from top to bottom for the majority of the year. We do get some thermoclines during the summer and some oxygen deficits, but for most of the year, the lake is well mixed. And it's a fairly eutrophic lake, which means that it's very productive. It's not as low productivity as a lot of the Adirondack lakes and things like that. So it is a very productive lake. So just a little background on what do we do. I do fisheries research. Mostly walleye and yellow perch are the two very popular sport fish in Oneida Lake with the anglers. We also work on bass, pickerel, sunfish, bullheads, all different fish populations. In addition, we work on the prey fish populations. So you can't have big walleyes unless they have lots to eat. In addition, our entire group, we have a lot of people that work on limnology. You can ask Travis Hall about this. Water temperature, we do a lot of water temperature monitoring. We take water quality measurements. We look at zooplankton and phytoplankton, which are the little critters that swim around in the water. We look at nutrients like phosphorus and nitrogen, see if they're increasing or decreasing. And we do some research with algae blooms, which are in the news quite a bit lately. So our program is sort of an all-encompassing ecosystem research program. We look at fish, we look at habitat, we look at birds like cormorants, and we look at people like fishermen. And of course, my talk would not be complete unless I put a plug in here for lake sturgeon, which are the most amazing fish in the world and the only one that really, really matters. I'm a little biased. But Oneida Lake also has lake sturgeon, which as of last summer had reached 139 pounds in Oneida Lake. This is one we caught in one of our survey nets, and these are some of our summer interns. And this fish was tagged and released. You can see we had to bend it in a half circle to fit it in a 6-foot kiddie pool. It's a big fish. So back to what I'm supposed to be talking about. This is a representation of the Oneida Lake food web. And this is a little bit simplified. It's a lot more complex than this, but the main thing that people are really interested, the anglers, are interested in the walleye and the yellow perch. So a lot of our research is focused on that, but we can't study those without studying things like zooplankton, algae, nutrients, emerald shiners and gizzard shad, zebra mussels, cormorants. So all of those things affect walleye. And today, I'm supposed to be talking about climate change. So some of the things that I'll be touching on are how could climate change affect Oneida Lake? How can we measure how the climate change affects Oneida Lake? How do we think it could, most importantly, impact the major sport fish? And why is it so difficult to measure climate change? Shouldn't we be able to say, yes, this is climate change, or no, it's not climate change? Why is it so hard? Hopefully I can touch on some of those, and if you guys have any questions, I would be glad to answer them. So looking at this Oneida Lake food web that I showed you from a climate change perspective, climate change could potentially affect just about every component of this food web. So it could affect the walleyes directly by water temperature. It could affect zooplankton and algae from nutrients changes, so they don't have enough to eat. It could affect things like zebra mussels, which prefer different water temperatures than some other creatures. So it can really affect all the different parts of the food web. So some of the specific potential ways that climate change could affect Oneida Lake, obviously the most important and the most direct would be water temperature. If it gets warmer, the water temperature is going to get warmer. How does that affect things? Climate change can also affect changes in populations that prefer warmer water. So you have some fish that prefer cold water, like trout and salmon. You have some fish that prefer warm water, like sunfish and bass. So the water temperature changes could affect those different species differently. The climate change could also affect the prey fish. Like I said, you don't get a walleye unless you have a lot of food for the fish to eat. The climate change can affect increased nutrients from runoff from the tributaries. So climate change is not only temperature, but there's changes, as Jim Teskey told us earlier, in runoff, rainfall, things like that. So that can also affect the lake. And if you get more nutrients, you tend to get more algae blooms. If you get more nutrients, you tend to get more weed growth because they have more nutrients. Another way that climate change can affect the lake is the length of the winter ice cover. Now that's important both biologically and from a human perspective because people want to ice fish. And if the ice is unsafe or if the ice season is shorter, people get really unhappy. So these are some of the things that I'm going to try and show you today with some data from Oneida Lake. And just a plug here, this is a sturgeon we caught in the Niagara River. This is how big the sturgeon in Oneida Lake will get in 50 years. So, climate change effects on water temperature. So, I don't know if you know a lot about fish, but they're cold-blooded. They are the same temperature as their surroundings. They don't produce any body heat. They mostly grow in the summer when the water's warm. When the water's cold in the winter, they do feed a little, but it's mostly for maintenance feeding. They don't really grow a lot in the winter. So they're mostly concerned with the summer season. Water temperature changes directly with the air temperature. However, it also is affected by the wind. If there's a lot of wind. Water temperature can be affected by rain, can be affected by runoff. So it's not just a real easy comparison. It's not just if the air gets warmer, the water gets warmer. It's a complex relationship. So we measure lots of water temperatures on Oneida Lake. We do it several different ways. The one that I'm most involved with is we have a stationary water temperature buoy. It monitors the water temperature continuously with a data recorder that we can download on the computer. And for the summer season from May to October, which we're most concerned with, we have every single day from 1968 to the present. That's a lot of water temperatures. That's my entire lifetime right there in water temperatures. And we also have started to do year-round temperatures. So we measure it right through the winter with a submerged temperature buoy. So from 2002 to today, which is what, 18 years, we have water temperatures for every single day of the year from this monitoring buoy. And that's a lot of data. That's about 60,000 water temperatures per year, which having a lot of data is great, but it also makes it really hard to analyze because you have so much data. So if we put a bunch of the water temperatures, all the water temperatures from 1968 to 2019, I think this graph goes through, this is kind of what it looks like. Now you can see all the different years are in different colors and they go all over the place. There's a lot of variability. The smooth black line through the center is the average for all those years. So that's the mean. You can see a lot of times it's higher, a lot of times it's lower. The black dotted line, black line with the points, I think is 2019. So that's just one summer. You can see earlier in the year, to the left on the graph, it was actually colder. During the middle of the summer, July and August, it was actually above average, the black line, compared to the average. And then it was average for a while, and it was pretty warm in the fall. So the water temperatures vary quite a bit. And how do we look at this in a view of climate change and say, did it increase? Did it not increase? The best way I've found to do that is to add up the number of degree days, and this is mostly during the summer, May to October. So if it's 20 degrees for 2 days, that's 80 degree days. That's how it's calculated. So this graph shows the number of degree days from 1968 to 2018. This is an annual average. And you can see that, again, it bounces all over the place, but we do see a fairly steady increase over that time period. And that's true whether you look at it May through October or June through August. Again, this is mostly the summer period that we're interested in. So water temperature has obviously increased, right? Well, yeah. This is what makes it difficult. There's a lot of variability. You saw how it varies over the summer, higher, lower, different times of the year. And because of that, it's difficult to make sound statistically significant scientific conclusions. So when you hear scientists talk in the news, they say, well, there's a 95% chance this is true, or we think this is the case, but we're not sure. That's why. It's because of all that variability that we can't make a statistically significant conclusion. It's very difficult. And another problem with making, strong conclusions is, what is your frame of reference? Okay, what does long-term mean? So our long-term data is 51 years. That's a long time. That's 1968 to 2019. But is that your frame of reference, or is it 1900 to present? Or is it the Ice Age until now? So you have to look at things in terms of what is your time frame. So one thing I've done is our water temperatures only went from 1968 to present. And I wanted to know, well, what if we go back farther? What was the water temperature? And we obviously weren't here to measure it, or I wasn't. So what I've done in the next couple of graphs is I've taken the air temperature, because that's been measured at the Syracuse airport back through, I think this graph is 1929 to present. And you can see that from 1929 to about 1960 or so, the air temperature actually decreased. And when our water temperatures start in about 1969 to present, the air temperature has actually increased. So even looking at our data that says, oh, the water temperature has obviously increased, that is partially due to the fact that the air temperatures have gone through a cyclic period as well. So what I did is I took the air temperatures, and in the next graph, the blue is our water temperatures. And you can see that they vary fairly closely with the air temperature. When the air temperature goes up, the water temperature goes up. When the air temperature goes down, the water temperature goes down. So what we can do is we can get a correlation between the two, and we can predict backwards using the air temperatures to say, what do we think the water temperature probably was based on the correlation? So in the next graph, the yellow line represents what I predicted the water temperature probably was back through 1929. And if you kind of average out that yellow line, you can see water temperatures used to be warm, and then they cooled off through the 70s and 80s, and then they warmed up again in the 2000s. So it's not real straightforward. It's tough to say, yes, the water temperatures have definitely increased due to climate warming, but there is a lot of other evidence that supports the fact that the water temperatures are increasing higher than they used to be. I need to update this graph because it only goes through 2012. But the rate of increase is much higher. So even though the water temperatures are just now surpassing what they used to be in the 40s, over the long term, they are increasing faster and probably higher than they used to be. So we said that nutrients can also be affected by climate change. So if you have warmer water, that tends to result in an increased thermocline, which is the difference between the temperature in the top of the water and the temperature in the bottom. So I said Oneida Lake usually is mixed pretty well and it doesn't have much of a thermocline. If it starts to warm up, it's going to have a larger thermocline. And what a thermocline does is it allows the lower bottom waters to have less oxygen. They go anoxic is what we call it. They lose oxygen because they're not mixing as well. And when you get low oxygen, that results in nutrient release from the sediments through anaerobic respiration by bacteria. So if you have low oxygen, you often get these nutrient releases, and more nutrients means more algae blooms in the summer. So we have people that go out and measure things like this. Here's just a graphic representation of all the things that can affect nutrients: sunlight, rain, runoff, stratification. This is a graph of the total phosphorus in Oneida Lake in blue, and you can see that it actually has gone down, which is not what we predicted with climate change. And you can see, let's see, in, I guess it's gray, is that gray color? SRP is soluble reactive phosphorus. And BDO in the red is biological oxygen demand, biological demand of oxygen, something like that. It's the oxygen demand. So you can see that it's gone up a little bit. And the lake is actually moving more from being, they call it external loading when things come in from the tributaries, to dominated by internal loading, which is phosphorus released from the sediments within the lake itself. So our people, I don't do the phosphorus studies, but the people that do them at our place have determined that there is some movement towards more internal loading. So this is the Oneida Lake watershed land use. So this is all the land that drains into Oneida Lake represented here in different colors by different land uses. And as those land uses change due to things like agriculture, building, climate change, things like that, that can change the internal versus external loading. But the challenge is the watershed is very large. There are a lot of non-point sources of pollution, and it just complicates things, and there's a lot of mitigations to the nutrient levels. And another plug for sturgeon here. I don't know how this got in here. Sturgeon actually are now spawning in the Oneida Lake ecosystem. We found the first sturgeon with eggs in 2012 in Baldwinsville. I don't know who that guy is in the picture. Back to climate change. Winter ice cover. I mentioned that if it gets warmer, winter ice cover can be reduced. Now we have a very interesting thing that we have some folks around the lake who have kept diaries of when did the ice come on, when did the ice go out. This is a graph of ice cover duration. So this is how long it was covered during the year. Let me just check. Yeah. So this is how long it was covered. You can see that back in the 1800s, it used to be quite a bit longer ice cover than it is now. And in fact, in 2000, we had almost no ice on the lake. And this is complete ice cover. There was some ice, but it was not complete. So you can see that the duration of ice cover is decreasing on Oneida Lake. This graph is the ice out day of the year. So this is when you have ice all winter, what day does it break up and melt? And it usually breaks up in one day. It gets very thin, and then the big wind comes along and all the ice breaks up in usually 1 or 2 days. So you can see that the day that the ice broke up has decreased quite a bit from 1825 until recently. Okay, we can also see increased aquatic weed growth from climate change. We had in 2011, I did some surveys around the whole lake using acoustics that measure the amount of aquatic vegetation, and that would be underwater vegetation. And about 16% of the lake was covered in 2011 with weeds. And this is the lake bottom. So we will go back and measure this again to see if it's increased due to water temperatures and nutrients. The problem is weeds are affected by a lot of other things besides climate change. The weed growth can be affected by water clarity. They can be affected by things like zebra mussels that filter the water and make it clearer. They can be affected by nutrient changes, wind. So it's not a clear-cut thing that climate change will or will not increase weed growth, but it does have an effect. Now the thing that I study is fish species. Fish species could change due to climate change. So we have cold water fish, where we used to in Oneida Lake. Oneida Lake during the 1800s used to have abundant Atlantic salmon, which are cold water fish. And those disappeared in the early 1900s. We also used to have cold water Cisco, and those have disappeared between about 1950 and 2000. There was a drastic decline. And now they're pretty much gone. We haven't seen one in, I don't know, 15 years probably. Burbot are another cold water fish. They're a type of codfish, freshwater cod. Their numbers have been drastically reduced. Now, warm water fish could actually have positive influence of climate change. It's not only climate change that affects fish species. We also have invasions of non-native fish into the lake. So for instance, white perch came in through the canal system, and they're a warm water fish, and white perch and gizzard shad have increased from the 50s through current. We also have round gobies that have had a large increase in the last 5 years, and they have a dramatic effect on the lake, but it's not due to climate change because they came in through the canals. They're an invasive species. But they are a species that likes warm water, and they do very well in our lake. Sunfish are another warm water species that may increase both due to water temperature and due to more weeds. So I'm going to show a couple graphs here. This is our graph of catch of burbot in Oneida Lake. That's the freshwater codfish. You see a picture there. And this is from bottom trawling. And from 1960 to current, we've seen a substantial decline in burbot. And we've done some energetic studies that show that burbot are very stressed by the warm water. So we think this is almost directly related to water temperature. Gizzard shad are another species that likes warm water. They're very abundant in a lot of southern reservoirs. And they're a bait fish species. The walleye feed on them. A lot of the other fish feed on them. So they have good effects on the fish when they're not too abundant. If they get overabundant, they can have negative effects on other fish. But you can see that they have expanded in the lake both due to invasion and due to the lake being warmer and more preference for gizzard shad. The fish that everybody's concerned about in Oneida Lake is the walleye. That's what people want to catch. This is the Oneida Lake walleye population, and this graph is a construction of the population based on a lot of different inputs. And you can see that the walleye population used to be a little higher, and then it went down for a while, and now it's actually coming back up. So climate change probably has not had a negative effect on walleye at this point. The warmer water hasn't really affected them. They do okay in it. And the walleye populations are actually doing fantastic right now. So not all fish are harmed or affected the same way by climate change. Sturgeon, which are obviously the king of fish, as I've mentioned several times, this is the first wild sturgeon that we've caught in Oneida Lake. So they were stocked originally, and the fish that are stocked are growing faster in Oneida Lake than in most other lakes where they're found. And that's probably due to the fact that Oneida is a warmer lake. So they grow faster because they're cold-blooded. And this is the first wild, naturally produced one we found. So some conclusions from Oneida Lake on climate change. First of all, the high variability makes it difficult to make strong scientific conclusions on climate change. And as you see in the news, when some people refute climate change and some people claim climate change, this variability and the difficulty in making a strong conclusion are often turned around to discredit the science. Many things are changing in addition to climate, and that makes it difficult to separate the effects. So we have fish that have variable recruitment. Some years they have great spawning years, some years they don't. We have non-native species introduction, zebra mussels and gobies. We have changes in nutrients from runoff, fertilizer, improvements in sewage treatment plants over the past 30 years. All these things are changing in addition to climate change, so trying to separate the effects of the different things is difficult. And also, climate changes affects things differently. It has some benefits to the warm water fish species. It reduces some of the cold water fish species. And another interesting thing is that climate change could reduce nutrients in some ways and increase nutrients in others. So people ask us, well, is climate change going to make it better or worse? And you say, well, in some ways it'll be better, in some ways it'll be worse. So we have to tease out all these different things. And to further complicate it, these food web interactions all affect each other. So nutrients affect gizzard shad, which affects walleye. When one thing changes, it can affect all the different parts of the food web. So again, it's difficult to tease out all these things. So our conclusions from Oneida Lake are that we need long-term data. And by long-term, we say, what is your frame of reference? Is it 20 years? Is 100 years enough? Do we need to go back to the Ice Age? Climate change in itself tends to destabilize a lot of the interactions within systems. So in that food web graph, we figure out how everything is related, and then climate change comes along and changes all that. So we have to study it again and say, well, how does this work now compared to what it used to work? And it causes increased variability. Now we're studying fish populations and lakes that already have high variability, and now climate change comes along and increases the variability. So again, it's hard to make a very strong conclusion. And the only other thing with climate change that I wanted to mention is that be careful what source you get your information from. Like I said, when we can't make a strong conclusion, some of the media people can take that and turn it around and say, well, you know, some things are actually beneficial for climate change, so maybe it's good. So you have to be very careful on how you look at it and where you get your information from. And the last plug I want to give is that in Oneida Lake, the major fish populations are still doing fantastic despite all the changes. And the ecosystems, we talk about ecosystem resiliency, how good does it do with change? And the resiliency in Oneida Lake so far has just been amazing, that they can survive all these changes and still do fantastic. Now, different systems respond differently. For instance, a lot of the low productivity Adirondack lakes are very sensitive to change. Oneida Lake in particular, being a high productivity lake, actually has a really high amount of ecosystem resiliency. It takes a lot to really harm or affect it. But other systems are harmed much easier. That's about all I have, really. Wanted to just, in case you haven't got the message, sturgeon are still the king of fishes. And I'd be happy to answer any questions if anyone has any. Donna, I didn't monitor the chat to see if you got any questions on chat or not, but if anybody has any questions, please chime in and I'd be glad to answer them.
Yeah, I have not seen any questions in the chat, but please feel free to ask Mr. Brooking any questions you might have.
Has anybody ever seen a sturgeon?
Oh, they're out. You do a lot of different shows and bring them out so that families can see them, touch them, hold them.
We try and get them out there.
So we have a question. So why do you like sturgeons?
They are the king of fish, obviously, and it has nothing to do with climate change, but sturgeon are a long-lived species. They can live over 100 years, 150 years sometimes. They can reach 300 pounds when they're full grown. They are probably the biggest fish you'll ever catch in freshwater, and I just think they're pretty amazing. Everybody who's ever caught one says they just can't say enough about it. They rant and rave about how fantastic they are.
Nice.
But this is a climate change seminar.
Okay, so another question. Are you familiar with the Tunisian Fish Lab in Lime Hollow? They raise sturgeons there?
Yes, I actually have done some netting studies with some of the people from Tunisia, and they do some of the netting studies on the Oswego River and the Genesee River, and they've done some Oneida Lake work as well. So
cool. Another question: have walleye changed their behavior due to climate change? Their numbers are up, but are they in the same places in the lake they've always been?
That's a good question. I don't have a really solid answer. My gut feeling is that they may be a little less active during the midsummer. So when the water's at its hottest during July and August, they may tend to feed less, they may tend to be less active, and that would mean that the anglers catch fewer during those hot months. As far as changing where they are in the lake, they use the entire lake system at different times of the year. Sometimes they're in shallow, sometimes they're out deep at different times of the year. It may affect when they're in those habitats, but they still use all the different habitats at different times of the year. Did that answer your question?
Any other questions? All right. Can you see the chat, Mr. Brooking?
I have to stop sharing my
Oh, no, I'll
screen.
read it to you. Mr. Hall says, thanks for all the great information. Can you comment on the merits of long-term data recording of the type you and others are doing at the field station, especially when it comes to climate change?
Well, that's a really good question, Mr. Hall, and he's kind of a plant because I'm pretty sure he used to work with us out there at the field station.
Yes.
I didn't know that.
Yes. Long-term data is extremely important. You can see in some of those water and air temperature graphs, if you look at the short term, you see an increase. And then when you look at the way back data, you say, oh, well, we're just getting back above normal, and there's cold periods, there's warm periods. Sometimes it's a 30-year cold period, sometimes it's a 50-year cold period. So having those long-term data sets is extremely important to understand does this affect your frame of reference? Is a 10-year increase in temperatures a big deal? Maybe. But when you look at it in the long term, then you can say, okay, the 10-year increase is more than it used to be or not more than it used to be. But having that long-term data to even out your frame of reference is very important.
Another question, does the water temperature and quality vary greatly in different parts of the lake? Like, is the water quality worse around Sylvan Beach?
It can be. It can vary between different parts of the lake quite a bit. That's mostly due to wind and wave currents. So if we get a wind that blows from west to east, it blows all the warm surface water down to Sylvan Beach, and algae tends to float to the surface, so it drifts all into Sylvan Beach and they get a big algae bloom. But at the other end of the lake, it might be nice and clear because it blew all the stuff down to Sylvan Beach. That usually is short-lived because the winds tend to switch back and forth from east to west and north to south. And usually those algae blooms last for a couple days or maybe a week. And then the wind comes and mixes it all up and drifts it somewhere else. So it can vary greatly from one end to the other based on which way the wind is blowing over the past couple days.
Any other questions? All right. Do any of the fish you have in the lake come from Onondaga?
Well, some might. That's one of those scientific non-answers. Oneida Lake is connected to Onondaga Lake through the river system. And Oneida Lake is upstream of Onondaga Lake. So as far as pollutants flowing into Oneida Lake, they do not flow into Oneida Lake from Onondaga Lake. However, fish can swim upstream. They have to go through several locks and dams to get between Onondaga Lake to Oneida Lake. And we think it's a very small number. There have been some fish caught at the Oneida Fish Hatchery that have tags in them from Onondaga Lake. So yes, some fish do move back and forth. We think it's a fairly small number. There's no reason to believe that it's a big number, but they can move. Fish don't stay where you put them. They move around a lot.
Another question, is the temperature data available to the public? If so, where can we go and get it?
We don't share the entire data set on the web because it's huge, for one thing. It is public data. It's collected with public money. The best thing is to email us. We have a website. If you Google the Cornell Biological Field Station, our email's on there. Send us an email. We'd be glad to send any data you like, share what whatever you need to answer your questions. We don't have it publicly available right now, I don't think, but we'd be glad to share it.
That would be good to be used in the classroom to have our kids analyze the data and to see if they can make any connections.
Now, to clarify that, we do go through, I'm trying to remember what it is. I think it's called eCommons. There's a couple data sharing websites that some of our data is shared on. So if you Google Oneida Lake data set or something to that effect, you may be able to get a lot of the data on those data sharing sites.
Okay. All right. Anybody else have any questions for Mr. Brooking?